The morning Timothy Chandler threw open the door of the farmhouse and stood trembling on the porch, his face carved out of something harder than grief, was the morning Lillian Rourke understood exactly how close they were to losing everything. "It is gone," he said, and his voice carried none of the warmth she had grown to love over these past 6 months. It was flat and cold and final, the way a judge sounds when the verdict has already been decided. Every last acre. The blight took it all. I walked the entire east field at dawn, and there is not one stalk worth saving. Not one. Lillian stood in the kitchen doorway with flour on her hands and her dark hair pinned up in a practical knot, and she watched the man she had married slowly come apart at the seams. Timothy Chandler was not a man who broke easily. He was 6 feet and 2 inches of hard-won muscle, with hands that had driven fence posts into frozen ground and pulled calves from difficult births without flinching. He had survived the war, survived drought, survived the kind of loneliness that turned lesser men into drifters or drunks. But standing there on that weathered porch in the early light of a Kansas morning in the autumn of 1878, he looked like a man who had finally met the wall he could not climb. "The banknote comes due in 43 days, he said. "Without the harvest, we lose the land. We lose all of it." Lillian did not speak immediately. She wiped her hands slowly on her apron, and Timothy misread that silence the way frightened men always misread the silence of capable women. He turned away from her, gripping the porch railing until his knuckles went white, and she could see the betrayal working through him, not betrayal from her, but from the land itself, from the promise this soil had made him when he first broke it with his own plow 10 years ago. "Timothy," she said quietly. "Do not tell me it will be all right," he said, and there was a rough edge in it, almost a warning. "Do not stand there and tell me there is another way, because I have been farming this land since before you arrived, and I know what a failed harvest looks like." She let the moment breathe. Then she said something that stopped him completely. "I know something about this land that you do not." He turned around slowly, and the look on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Not anger, not dismissal, but the very specific expression of a man who has just realized, for the first time, that the woman standing across from him might be carrying something he never thought to ask about. "Then you had better show me," he said. But to understand why those words cracked the world open between them, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the letter and the photograph, and the woman who arrived on a Wednesday afternoon stage with 2 leather trunks and a reputation she had not yet earned in Harlan County, Kansas. It was the spring of 1878 when Timothy Chandler first wrote the letter. He had not wanted to write it. His neighbor and closest friend, a broad-shouldered German farmer named Ernst Halger, had been the one to press the matter over a shared bottle of whiskey on a Sunday evening, pointing out with the blunt honesty of a man who considered, tact a kind of deception that Timothy had not spoken to a woman in any meaningful way in over 2 years, that his farmhouse was falling into the kind of disorder that only loneliness produces, and that a man farming 430 acres by himself with nothing but a horse named Josiah and a dog named Captain for company was a man headed somewhere dark. "Write to the agency," Ernst had said. "My cousin did it. Works out fine." Timothy had been resistant. He was 31 years old, and he had the kind of pride that sits quietly in a man and makes him believe that needing help is the same thing as admitting weakness. He had grown up in Missouri, the son of a farmer and a schoolteacher, and he had come west after the war with nothing but a land claim and a determination to build something that would outlast his own lifetime. The land had required everything from him. It had taken his youth and his easy smile and several years of sleep, and in return it had given him something magnificent, 430 acres of deep Kansas prairie soil that could grow corn and wheat and sorghum in quantities that made the men at the grain exchange in Dodge City sit up a little straighter when he walked in. But Ernst was right about one thing. The farmhouse was a sorrowful place. There were dishes that had not been properly washed in longer than Timothy cared to admit, and a parlor that contained only a single chair because he had never seen any purpose in having more than one, and a bedroom that was cold even in summer because cold is not a physical thing when a person sleeps alone long enough. It is a thing that gets into the walls. So he wrote the letter. He addressed it to the Hargrove Placement Agency in St. Louis, and he described himself honestly, which was more than most men did. He was 31. He had a working farm in good standing, 430 acres of which approximately 300 were under active cultivation. He had a frame house with 4 rooms and a cellar, a barn that could hold 20 horses though he only owned 2, and a smokehouse that was used regularly. He had a small savings account at the Harlan County Bank and no outstanding debts. He wanted a wife. He wanted someone capable and honest and willing to work alongside him. He said nothing about beauty or youth or any of the other things men usually demanded, because he had been in the war and he had seen enough of the world to understand what actually mattered. The agency replied 6 weeks later with a list of 3 candidates. 2 of them had been placed elsewhere by the time he read the descriptions. The third was a woman named Lillian Rourke, 26 years old, from Charlottesville, Virginia, by way of a 5-year sojourn in northern Missouri where she had, according to the agency's description, worked as a horticulturalist and plant cultivator at a research station operated by the Missouri Agricultural Society. Timothy had to read that last part twice. He was a farmer. He knew farming. But a woman with formal agricultural training was not something he had expected, and he was not entirely sure how he felt about it. Part of him found it impressive. Another part of him, the part shaped by 31 years of being a man in a world that had very particular ideas about what women knew and didn't know, felt something more like wariness. He wrote back to the agency saying he was interested, and he enclosed a letter for Miss Rourke herself. Her reply arrived in 3 weeks, and it was the letter that changed things. Most women who wrote to the agency were careful. They were warm and pleasant and deliberately non-threatening. They described their domestic skills in detail because that was what was expected of them. Lillian Rourke did not write that kind of letter. Her handwriting was clear and precise, and she wrote in complete, grammatically exact sentences with a vocabulary that suggested she had read more books than most people Timothy had ever met. She wrote that she had grown up on a tobacco farm in Virginia, that she had watched her father lose that farm to a combination of soil exhaustion and ignorance, and that she had decided at the age of 15 that she would understand land the way other people understood language, deeply and completely, and in all its complexities. She had spent 5 years in Missouri studying soil chemistry, plant disease, crop rotation principles, and what she called the hidden ecology of cultivated fields, which she explained as the network of interactions between soil microbes, root systems, water tables, and atmospheric conditions that most farmers never observed because they were too busy looking at what was above the ground to notice what was happening beneath it. She said she was not writing to impress him. She said she was writing because she believed in honesty as a foundational principle of any lasting arrangement, and she wanted him to know exactly who she was before either of them made a decision. She said she was capable, she was independent, and she would not pretend otherwise. She also said she was willing to work, genuinely and completely, and that she believed a farm run by 2 people who respected each other's intelligence was a farm that could last. Timothy read that letter 3 times in one sitting. Then he wrote back and said yes. She arrived on the 2nd Wednesday of May, and the stage from Dodge City came in 40 minutes late because of a broken wheel outside of Cimarron. Timothy had been waiting at the stage depot in Harlan since noon, standing with his hat in his hands and Josiah hitched to the post outside, feeling like a complete fool. Ernst had offered to come with him for moral support, and Timothy had refused, which he was beginning to regret. The stage came in through a cloud of dust, and the driver cursed the horses down to a stop, and the passengers began to emerge. An older gentleman in a suit that had seen better decades. A young man with the look of a traveling salesman about him. Two women together who were clearly traveling to meet family from their easy comfort with each other. And then Lillian Rourke stepped down from the stage. She was not what he had imagined. He had not imagined specifically, because imagining felt like setting himself up for disappointment. But he had some unexamined sense of what a woman from Virginia who studied plants would look like, and she was not it. She was taller than he expected, with a straight-backed, assured posture that reminded him more of the officers he had served under than any woman he had known. She wore a practical dark blue dress and a light traveling jacket, and her dark hair was pinned up in a way that suggested she had done it herself, efficiently, without a mirror. She had dark eyes that moved quickly across the scene in front of her, taking in the depot and the street and the buildings and finally him. She walked directly to him, which he appreciated. "Mr. Chandler," she said, extending her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm. "Miss Rourke," he said, "good to meet you. I hope the journey was bearable." "It was long and dusty," she said, "which I expected. Is your farm far from here?" "About 8 miles east," he said. "We can make it before dark if we leave soon." "Then we should leave soon," she said simply, and went back to supervise the unloading of her 2 trunks with the focused efficiency of a woman who had been managing logistics entirely on her own for quite some time. Timothy watched her direct the driver with quiet authority on how to handle a particular trunk that apparently contained something fragile, and he felt the first genuine stirring of something he could not yet name. Not attraction exactly, though she was attractive in an unassuming way. It was something closer to recognition. The feeling of meeting someone who was, fundamentally, not wasting their time. They were married 3 weeks later in the small Methodist church in Harlan, with Ernst Halger and his wife Marta as witnesses and the Reverend Caldwell presiding. It was a quiet, plain ceremony, the way both of them wanted it. Lillian wore a cream-colored dress she had made herself from fabric she had brought in one of her trunks, and Timothy wore his best shirt and his least worn pair of trousers. And when the Reverend asked if he took this woman, he said yes, with a directness that surprised even him. She had been on the farm for 3 weeks before the marriage, staying in the farmhouse in the bedroom that had been Timothy's, while he slept in the barn on a cot he had used during planting season for years. It was during those 3 weeks that Lillian had begun her own private investigation of the land. Timothy had noticed it but misread it. He saw her walking the fields in the early morning before he was properly awake, saw her crouching in the soil and bringing handfuls of it to her face and smelling it, saw her kneeling beside the creek that ran along the southern edge of the property, and testing the water with small glass vials she produced from her trunk. He assumed she was curious, the way a newcomer was curious, and he appreciated that she seemed interested in the farm rather than merely tolerating it. He did not understand what she was actually doing. After they were married, the daily rhythms of the farm absorbed them both. Timothy ran the operation the way he always had, with the systematic confidence of a man who had been farming this specific land for 10 years and knew its patterns the way he knew his own breath. He planted the eastern fields with corn in late May, as he always did. The western fields went to winter wheat, which would be harvested the following spring. He kept a kitchen garden near the house and a small orchard of apple and pear trees that were only just beginning to produce seriously. He was, by any reasonable measure, a successful farmer. Lillian threw herself into the work without complaint and without waiting to be told what needed doing. She was up before dawn every morning. She cooked with an efficiency that had nothing showboating about it. She repaired a section of fence along the north pasture that had been failing for months, using a technique Timothy had not seen before but that, when he examined it later, was clearly superior to his own method. She reorganized the root cellar in a way that nearly doubled its effective storage capacity. She was in every visible way exactly what she had described herself as being, capable, honest, and genuinely committed to the work. But she was also doing something else, and she had not told him about it yet, because she was not yet certain he would understand. The summer of 1878 was cruel. It started with heat that arrived early and stayed long, baking the prairie in a way that made the older farmers in Harlan County look at their wells with quiet dread. By July, the creek along the south edge of the Chandler farm had dropped to a trickle that barely covered the stones. The corn in the eastern fields went pale with heat stress, the leaves curling inward during the worst of the afternoon. Timothy watched it with the controlled anxiety of a man who has weathered bad seasons before, but knows that controlled anxiety is not the same as not being afraid. Then the blight came. It arrived in early August as a faint discoloration on the lower leaves of the corn, a yellowing at the edges that Timothy recognized immediately, because he had seen it before, years ago, on his father's farm in Missouri. It was a fungal disease, the kind that traveled on hot, dry winds and took hold in weakened plants and spread with a speed that seemed impossible until you had watched it happen. He treated the affected plants with the standard methods available to him in 1878, which were limited and largely insufficient. He removed infected plants and burned them. He applied a copper sulfate solution to the surrounding rows. He watered more carefully, trying to avoid wetting the leaves. It was not enough. The blight spread. By September, the eastern fields were a disaster. He walked them in the gray dawn light of each morning and watched the damage accumulate with the helpless precision of a man watching a fire he cannot control. The plants were yellow and stunted, and the ears that had formed were small and puckered, the kernels shrunken inside their husks. He made his calculations grimly and privately, and he arrived at a number that made his stomach turn. Even with the wheat from the western fields, which had fared better, he would be short. He would be short of what he needed to make the payment on the bank note he had taken out 2 years ago to purchase the additional acreage on the south end of the property. 43 days. That was what the calendar told him. And that was the morning he stood on the porch and told his wife that everything was gone, and she said, quietly and with complete confidence, that she knew something about this land that he did not. They walked together across the farmyard in the early morning light, Lillian with her worn leather satchel over her shoulder, the one she always carried into the fields. Timothy noticed, not for the first time, that the satchel clinked faintly as she moved, the glass vials inside it shifting against each other. He had always found that sound oddly reassuring without knowing why. "Where are we going?" he asked. "South Field," she said. "The section you left fallow this year." He frowned. The South Field, roughly 60 acres of it, was land he had left unplanted this season as a rest year, a practice he employed every few years to let the soil recover. There was nothing there but wild grass and the occasional volunteer plant that had seeded itself from previous seasons. He had barely looked at it since spring. "What is in the South Field?" he asked. "Something I planted in June," she said. "I was going to tell you about it sooner. I kept waiting for the right moment." He stopped walking. "You planted in my fallow field without telling me." She stopped too and turned to face him, and her dark eyes were steady and unfrightened in a way that, even in his agitation, he noticed and respected. "I planted in the fallow field without telling you because I needed to be certain it would work before I introduced it as a solution," she said. "I am not in the habit of promising things I am not sure of." He stared at her. "What did you plant?" "Sorghum," she said, "but not the variety you know. A specific cultivar I brought with me from the Missouri station. It was developed there over the past 3 years from varieties that originated in drier climates. It is extremely drought-tolerant, it matures in a shorter window than conventional sorghum, and it is resistant to the type of fungal blight that took the eastern fields." The silence between them stretched like a wire pulled too tight. "You brought seed from Missouri," he said slowly. "I brought 11 pounds of it, yes, in the smaller of my 2 trunks." He thought about the trunks. He thought about the trunk she had been so careful about when directing the stage driver. He thought about her walks in the South Field during the summer, which he had noticed and filed away as curiosity, and which now rearranged themselves in his mind into something else entirely. "Show me," he said. They walked the rest of the way in silence, and then they stepped through the gate at the south end of the farmyard, and Timothy Chandler experienced the second most shocking moment of his life, the first being a particular morning during the war that he did not think about when he could help it. The south field was not empty. It was not the barren stretch of rough, fallow grass he had glanced at from a distance and dismissed. The south field was full. Row upon row of sorghum plants stretched across the 60 acres, shorter than conventional sorghum but dense and richly green, their seed heads fat and heavy and drooping with the weight of grain. They were remarkable, not in the showy way of something decorative, but in the quiet, serious way of something that had done exactly what it was supposed to do under conditions that would have destroyed something lesser. They had not bent to the drought. They had not bowed to the blight. They had simply, methodically produced. Timothy walked into the rows without speaking. He reached out and took a seed head in his hands, the way a farmer does when he is assessing quality, and he felt the weight of it and pulled a few kernels free and examined them. They were plump and fully formed, dense and perfectly developed. He walked further into the field and did the same thing again. And again. And each time he found the same thing. A crop in full health, fully mature, ready for harvest. He walked for a long time. The morning light moved across the field as the sun climbed, and the seed heads caught it and turned it golden, and the sound of the wind through 60 acres of healthy sorghum was one of the most beautiful things Timothy Chandler had ever heard, and he was not a man who used the word beautiful easily. When he came back to where Lillian was standing at the edge of the field, he stopped in front of her and he looked at her for a long time with an expression she had not seen on his face before. "How?" he said, and the word came out rough and not entirely steady. "I mapped the soil in the south field in May," she said, slipping naturally into the precise language of someone explaining a method they know thoroughly. "The soil there has a higher clay content than the eastern fields, which means it retains moisture longer during dry periods. It also sits slightly lower, which allows it to capture runoff during the sporadic rain events we did have this summer, even when they were brief. It was the ideal location for a drought-tolerant variety. I also rotated the planting rows at a 15-degree angle to the prevailing wind, which reduced evapotranspiration and created a natural windbreak effect between the rows." He kept looking at her. "I harvested samples from 3 random rows 2 weeks ago," she continued. "The yield projection across 60 acres based on the sample weights is approximately 2,300 bushels. At current market prices in Dodge City, that should be sufficient to cover the bank note payment with a modest surplus." She reached into her leather satchel and produced a small notebook, which she opened to a page dense with calculations in her clean, precise handwriting, and she held it out to him. He took it, he looked at the numbers, he looked at the field, he looked back at the numbers, and then he did something that surprised them both. He sat down on the ground. Not collapsing, not falling. He simply sat down in the dirt at the edge of the field, the way a man sometimes has to sit down when the weight lifts so suddenly that his legs briefly forget what they are for. Lillian sat down beside him. Not because she thought he needed her close, but because she was tired too, tired from months of carrying this secret hope, this calculated gamble she had taken not behind his back from dishonesty, but ahead of his knowledge from a kind of fierce protectiveness. She had not expected to feel for a man she had married as a practical arrangement. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked. "Because if it had failed," she said, "I did not want you to grieve twice." He turned his head and looked at her sideways, and in the early autumn light with the sorghum field stretching out golden and magnificent behind them, Lillian Rourke understood for the first time that the careful arrangement she had made when she stepped off the stage in Harlan was becoming something else entirely. "That was not your burden to carry alone," he said quietly. "I know," she said. "I am still learning to share things." He was quiet for a moment. A meadowlark called somewhere in the middle distance, and the wind moved through the field with a sound like a held breath finally released. "I owe you an apology," he said. She looked at him. "For what?" "For this morning, on the porch. I spoke to you as though your understanding of this land was worth nothing, as though you were not a person whose knowledge mattered." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "You were frightened, I understood that." "That is not an excuse," he said firmly. "You are my wife." "And you are." He paused, and she could see him working to find the right words, which was not something Timothy Chandler did often because he was not a man who usually struggled for words. He just sometimes struggled to say the ones that mattered most. "You are extraordinary at what you do. I do not think I have said that plainly enough." "You have never said it at all," she said, without bitterness. "No," he said. "I have not. I am saying it now." The harvest took 12 days. Timothy hired 2 of the seasonal hands who worked for Ernst Halger in the summers, brothers named Colt and Virgil Denny, and between the 4 of them they brought the south field in with a speed and efficiency that astonished the Denny brothers, who had never seen sorghum grow like that on a dry-year farm. They cut and threshed and loaded, and Timothy made 2 trips to Dodge City with the wagon full. And at the grain exchange, a man named Purvis, who had worked there for 15 years, examined the quality of the grain with an expression of surprised respect, and told Timothy he would pay a premium on the lot. Timothy paid the bank note with $480 to spare. He stood outside the bank in Dodge City with the receipt in his hand, and felt the relief move through him like the first drink of water after a very long dry stretch. And he thought about his wife, and he turned around and walked straight to the general merchandise store. He bought her a set of botanical illustration books he had seen in the window there 2 months ago and noted without knowing why. He bought a new leather satchel to replace the one she carried, which was worn through at one corner, and had a strap that he had seen her quietly mend twice. He bought a small tin of the particular tea she had mentioned once, precisely once, as something she missed from Virginia, and then he stood in the middle of the store feeling like a man who has woken up very late to something that was obvious from the beginning. He was in love with his wife. He was not certain when it had happened. The arrangements of a practical marriage had not prepared him for it, and he was aware that he had been slower than he should have been, in seeing past the contract of the thing to the actual person he had been living beside. He thought about the morning she had fixed the fence and the quiet satisfaction on her face as she surveyed her own work. He thought about the way she read in the evenings, completely absorbed with her feet tucked under her in the parlor chair, the second chair she had acquired from the Halgers when Marta had decided to replace it, and how she would sometimes read a passage aloud to him, not because she expected him to engage with it, but because she found something beautiful in language, and beauty was a thing she could not entirely keep to herself. He thought about the way she had sat down beside him in the dirt at the edge of the south field, not to comfort him, but because she was tired too, and it was honest. He drove home from Dodge City in the dark because he had stayed too long and he did not care, and Josiah knew the road and did not need much direction. The stars were enormous over the Kansas prairie, and the night smelled of cut grass and the faint mineral edge that meant the temperature had dropped quickly after sunset. He thought, as he often did on this road in the dark, that this land was the most beautiful place he had ever been, and then he thought that he had never told Lillian that either. She was awake when he got home. The lamp was lit in the kitchen, and she was at the table with her notebook, making calculations he suspected were related to what she was already planning for the following spring. She looked up when he came in, and the look on her face was the particular expression of someone who has been expecting a person to walk through the door and did not quite want to admit how much. "You are very late," she said. "I know," he said. He set the parcels from the general store on the table and watched her look at them with confusion. "What is this?" "Open them," he said. She opened them carefully, the way she did everything, methodically but not without curiosity. When she unwrapped the botanical books she went very still, and then she opened the first one to the title page and ran one finger across the engraving there, and Timothy watched her face change. "These are from the Hooker collection," she said quietly. "I had these in Missouri, but I had to leave them when I came west. I did not think I would find them again." "The man at the store said they had been there for months," Timothy said. "He seemed relieved to see them go to someone who knew what they were." She looked at the tea tin. Her expression did something complicated and private. "I mentioned this exactly once," she said. "Once was enough," he said. She put the tin down and looked at him across the table, and there was something in the air between them that had not been there before, or rather that had been there for some time, but that neither of them had yet named. The farmhouse was warm from the stove and smelled of the bread she had baked that afternoon, and outside the wind had picked up and was moving through the remaining corn stubble with a sound like distant conversation. "Timothy," she said. "Yes," he said. "What are we doing?" It was such a direct question. It was such a Lillian question that he almost laughed, and the laugh that rose in him was not the hollow performance of social interaction, but something genuine and warm, the kind of laugh that means you have encountered something that delights you. "I think," he said carefully, coming to sit down across from her, "that we are trying to figure out how to tell each other the truth." She considered this with the same serious attention she gave to soil samples. "I have been honest with you about everything except the field," she said. "I know," he said. "And about the field your reasons were good ones. I understood that sitting out there this morning." "Were you angry?" she asked. "For about 4 minutes," he said. "And then I saw the grain." She almost smiled. "The grain was persuasive." "The grain was extraordinary," he said. "You were extraordinary, you are. I have not said that enough. I have not said it at all, and I should have long before this." The almost smile became a real one, and Timothy Chandler decided in that moment that Lillian Rourke's smile was the most unreasonably beautiful thing he had seen in 31 years of looking at the world, which was a thought that would have alarmed him 4 months ago and now felt simply, inescapably true. "I was afraid you would resent it," she said quietly. "That I knew something about the land that you did not." He leaned forward across the table. "Lillian," he said, "I was raised by a schoolteacher and a farmer. My mother knew more than my father about half the things that mattered, and my father was not a fool. He was just a man who had grown up in a world that told him to pretend otherwise. I watched that cost them both something. I swore I would not be that kind of man." She looked at him steadily. "And were you that kind of man?" He held her gaze. "I was this morning, on the porch. When I spoke to you as though there was nothing you could tell me about my own land." "Yes," she said simply, "you were." "It will not happen again," he said. "I know," she said, and he heard in that two-word answer something that was not a forgiveness so much as an assessment, a verdict delivered by someone who meant it. They sat across from each other in the lamplight for a while longer, and then Timothy said, "I have been thinking about spring." "So have I," she said, and reached for her notebook. They talked until well past midnight. Lillian had plans for the south field that involved a rotation of the drought-tolerant sorghum with a legume crop she had studied in Missouri, which would fix nitrogen in the soil and increase the productivity of the next planting cycle. She had ideas about the water management of the eastern fields that involved a series of shallow drainage channels that would improve the soil drainage and reduce the conditions that had allowed the blight to take hold. She had been cataloging the soil types across the entire 430 acres in a systematic way, and she produced her notebooks and spread them on the table and walked him through what she had found. And Timothy listened with the full and genuine attention of a man who has stopped pretending he knows something he doesn't. It was the best conversation he had ever had about farming. When they finally went to bed, the strangeness of the new thing between them made the air feel different. Their marriage had been, until very recently, the kind of practical partnership that two honest people can maintain without requiring much of each other in the way of vulnerability. They had been respectful and cordial and occasionally, carefully, warm. But something had shifted. Timothy lay awake in the dark and listened to the farm settle around him. the familiar sounds of the house cooling, the distant movement of the horses in the barn, and he thought about the woman in the next room, who had come to him from 3 states away with her glass vials and her notebooks, and 11 pounds of seed that no one had asked her to bring, and who had quietly saved his farm while he was standing on the porch convincing himself it was already lost. He got up before dawn the next morning and made breakfast for the first time since Lillian had arrived in May, because he was not a bad cook. He had simply stopped doing it when there was someone else to do it, which now struck him as a failure of imagination he intended to correct. He made eggs and cornbread and strong coffee, and when Lillian came downstairs still pulling her hair up into its practical knot and found it all waiting on the table, she stopped in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was almost identical to the one he had worn standing at the edge of the south field. "You made breakfast," she said. "I did," he said. "Sit down." She sat down. She ate the eggs and the cornbread with the straightforward appreciation of someone who had been working hard and was genuinely hungry, and then she put down her fork and looked at him across the table with those dark, quick eyes that never missed anything. "What happened?" she asked. "Nothing happened," he said. "I made breakfast. People do that." "You have not made breakfast in 6 months," she said. "I should have," he said, "among other things." She picked up her coffee cup and regarded him over the rim of it with an expression that was beginning to do something to his composure. "Timothy," she said, "are you courting me?" "I am your husband," he said. "I cannot court you." "That is not an answer to the question I asked," she said, with a precision that was very characteristic. He looked at her directly. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I am." The expression that crossed her face then was something he did not have a precise word for. It was not surprise exactly, and it was not the bright, uncomplicated happiness of someone who has been given something they always expected. It was something quieter and more guarded and more genuine than either of those things, the expression of someone who has lived a life that required self-sufficiency and is slowly, carefully deciding whether it might be safe to need something. "All right," she said after a moment. "All right." He said, "All right," she repeated, and took another sip of her coffee, and the curve at the corner of her mouth was a thing Timothy decided he was going to spend the rest of his life doing his best to earn. The weeks that followed were a kind of opening. Ernst and Marta Halger came for supper one evening in October, and Marta, who had the warm and slightly terrifying perceptiveness of a woman who had been married for 20 years and paid close attention to everyone around her, watched Timothy and Lillian at the table for approximately 12 minutes before she caught Ernst's eye with a look that said something had changed. Ernst, who paid less careful attention, simply noted that his neighbor seemed happier than he had been in years and that the Chandler farm smelled powerfully of fresh bread, and something else he could not identify, which was Lillian's particular combination of soil samples and dried botanical specimens that lived in the corner of the kitchen on a dedicated shelf. "Your wife is remarkable," Marta told Timothy when they were out of Lillian's hearing. "Yes," Timothy said, with a directness that made Marta blink. "You have figured that out," she said, not quite making it a question. "Recently," he said. "Yes," Marta laughed, a warm and slightly exasperated laugh. "Men," she said, with complete accuracy. Timothy had begun accompanying Lillian on her early morning field walks, not directing, not leading, simply walking beside her and listening while she explained what she was seeing. He had learned over the previous months that Lillian Rourke talked very little in social situations, being naturally reserved, but that when she was in the fields or in the kitchen of the root cellar or sitting with her notebooks, she opened like a door that had been properly hung, smooth and wide, and without resistance. She talked about soil in a way that made it sound like something alive and intelligent, which in her understanding it essentially was. She talked about root systems and mycorrhizal networks, and the relationship between the composition of prairie grass and the long-term fertility of the soil beneath it. And Timothy listened and asked questions, and was frequently surprised by his own engagement with things he thought he already knew. One morning in late October, she showed him something in the far eastern corner of the property, a section of fence line where the native prairie grasses were still intact, never having been broken by a plow. "Feel this," she said, and crouched and pushed her fingers into the soil at the very edge of the unplowed ground. He crouched beside her and did the same. The soil was startlingly different from the cultivated fields nearby. It was darker and softer, and the texture was almost spongy with the mass of root material within it. It smelled like rain even in the dry autumn air. "This is what the whole farm looked like before the first plow cut it," Lillian said. "This is the baseline. This is what we are trying to approximate partially in the cultivated fields. We cannot restore it entirely, because we are growing crops and the prairie does not, but the closer we can bring the soil health of the cultivated fields to something like this, the more resilient the crops will be." Timothy looked at the soil on his fingers. "My father broke land in Missouri," he said. "He never talked about what it was before." "Most people did not," Lillian said. "It was not seen as relevant. The land was a resource to be used." She paused. "I think that was a mistake. I think the land is a system to be understood." He looked at her profile in the early light, the clean line of her jaw and the way she was looking at the soil with an expression that was almost tender. "You love this," he said, "not just the work of it. You love it the way I love the farm itself." She looked up at him, and there was something in her expression that was slightly startled, as though he had said something that cut closer to a truth she kept private than she had expected from him. "Yes," she said, "I do. I am glad you came here," he said quietly. "I need you to know that. Not for the harvest, not for the farm, for here." He touched his chest once briefly with 2 fingers, the most direct gesture he was capable of in that moment. Lillian looked at him for a long time without speaking. A red-tailed hawk turned slow circles above the eastern field, and the sky was the particular sharp blue of a Kansas October, and somewhere north of them a cow at the Halger farm called for her calf in the distant, mournful way that cows do. "Timothy," she said, and then she reached across and put her hand over his, the one that was resting on his knee, and the warmth of it went through him like a key turning in a lock he had forgotten he had. They rode back to the farmhouse in a silence that was entirely different from the silence they had started with, which had been the functional quiet of 2 people operating in parallel. This was a together silence, the kind that is not empty. November arrived with a week of hard frost that settled the earth and quieted the farm into its winter rhythms. There was less field work to do, which meant more evenings at the kitchen table, and in the small parlor that had grown considerably warmer and more livable since Lillian had quietly added a second lamp and a rag rug, and the particular quality of presence that fills up space in a way that is difficult to describe but impossible to miss. She was teaching herself to do the farm accounts properly, not because Timothy's system was wrong, but because she wanted to understand the full financial picture of the operation, and because, as she told him with the directness he was coming to love, she did not believe in being dependent on another person's knowledge of something she could learn herself. He had, at first, felt a flicker of something about this. A small, reflexive thing that he recognized immediately as the particular male discomfort of being very slightly unnecessary. And then he had thought about his mother and his father, and about what Lillian had told him about watching her own father lose his farm to ignorance, and he had handed over the account books without hesitation. She found an error within the first week. Not a significant one, a double entry on a feed purchase from the previous year, but she showed it to him without any triumph, simply as information, and he looked at it and said, "You have a better eye for numbers than I do," and she said, "Different people have different eyes. That is not a flaw in anyone," and that was the end of it. In early December, Timothy asked Ernst Halger to watch the farm for 3 days, and he took Lillian to Dodge City. She had mentioned once, in passing, that she had not been to a proper town since arriving in Kansas, and he had filed this away. Dodge City in the winter of 1878 was not the frenetic cattle season place it was in the summer months, but it was still a town with hotels and restaurants and 2 dry goods stores and a small but genuine lending library that the Ladies' Improvement Society had established 3 years earlier. It was also, which Lillian did not know, where the Regional Agricultural Society met quarterly, and Timothy had discovered that the December meeting was happening during the 3 days he had planned. He told her about the meeting on the morning of the second day. He had secured an invitation for her from the Society's local secretary, a man named Abernathy who had been skeptical about the propriety of a woman attending the technical session until Timothy had described, with precise brevity, the South Field. Abernathy had changed his mind promptly. The Agricultural Society meeting took place in the back room of the Dodge City Mercantile Exchange, and it was populated by the kind of men who took farming seriously enough to discuss it in organized settings, which in 1878 was still a relatively small and self-selecting group. There were 12 of them besides Timothy and Lillian, all men, most middle-aged, most with the weathered look of people who spent significant portions of their lives outdoors. They looked at Lillian when she walked in with the particular combination of surprise and careful neutrality that men of that era employed when confronted with a woman in a context they had not anticipated. But Abernathy introduced her as the person responsible for developing the drought-tolerant sorghum cultivation method that had produced 2,300 bushels on a 60-acre fallow field during the driest growing season in 5 years in Harlan County, and the careful neutrality sharpened into something else entirely. She presented her methodology with the calm clarity of someone who had been thinking about it for a very long time and had it organized. She talked about the soil mapping process, the cultivar selection, the planting rotation, the water management techniques she had employed. She drew diagrams on the chalkboard at the front of the room with a confidence that silenced the occasional murmur. She answered questions with precision and without defensiveness, and when a man named Halkett suggested that her results might have been affected by variables she had not accounted for, she produced her notebooks and walked him through the sampling methodology with such thoroughness that he sat back in his chair and said, quietly but clearly, "That is exceptionally rigorous work, Mrs. Chandler." And the room, almost as one, shifted. Timothy sat in the back row and watched his wife stand at the front of the room full of men who had doubted her presence, and he felt something enormous and uncomplicated moving through him. It was pride, the specific pride that has nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with witnessing someone you love at their best. 3 of the men asked if they could correspond with her about the methods. Abernathy asked if she would be willing to present at the spring meeting. A man from the western end of the county who had lost a significant portion of his own crop to the same blight that had hit the Chandler farm's eastern fields asked, with genuine urgency, if she would be willing to advise him before planting season. She said yes to all 3. On the walk back to the hotel that evening, their breath misting in the cold December air, Lillian was quieter than usual. Timothy walked beside her and did not press. He had learned that quiet in Lillian was almost always productive, and eventually she would bring out what had been forming in it. "They surprised me," she said finally. "Which ones?" "Most of them," she said. "I expected to be dismissed. I have been dismissed before at the Missouri station by men who could not quite accept that a woman had understood something they had not. I prepared for that. And instead," she glanced at him sideways, "instead they listened. Most of them actually listened." "You gave them results that were difficult to argue with," Timothy said. "That is always the safeguard," she said. "Data, recorded observations, reproducible methods. You cannot dismiss what you can verify." He stopped walking. They were in front of the hotel, and the lamplight from the window fell across the sidewalk in a warm stripe. "Lillian," he said. She stopped too. She looked at him with those quick, serious eyes. "I love you," he said. "I should have said it before now. I am saying it now." The night street was quiet around them and the cold air was very still, and Lillian Rourke looked at Timothy Chandler for a long, searching moment in which he felt himself very thoroughly examined. "I love you too," she said. "I have for some time. I was not certain when to say it." "Earlier would have been fine," he said. "Earlier would have been fine for you as well," she said, and there was enough of the faintest, driest, most exact humor in it that he laughed. And then she laughed, and they stood on the frozen sidewalk in Dodge City and laughed together in a way that felt like something long held becoming finally, completely free. He kissed her then, there on the street, which was not entirely proper, and he did not care even slightly. She kissed him back, which meant she did not care either. They walked into the hotel together, and the clerk at the desk looked at them with the small, knowing smile of someone who has been working a hotel long enough to recognize the difference between two people who are traveling together and two people who are in love. They went home to the farm 2 days later through a light December snow that dusted the prairie in white and made the world look absolutely clean. Josiah trotted along the road with the comfortable confidence of a horse who knows his way home, and Timothy drove with one arm, because the other arm was around his wife who had moved against his side without making a production of it, simply because the seat of a wagon in December snow is cold and the person beside you is warm. The winter was the longest and best winter Timothy had spent on the farm. They planned the spring planting together, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with Lillian's notebook spread between them and the lamp turned up high, the stove sending out steady warmth against the cold that pressed against the windows. Lillian's plans were, as they always were, meticulous. She had a 3-year rotation mapped out for every field on the property, with detailed soil amendment schedules, and a proposed expansion of the drought-tolerant sorghum acreage to include a second plot on the south end of the west field. She also had plans for something she had not yet mentioned, which she brought out on a January evening when the wind was screaming across the prairie and the temperature had dropped below zero outside. "I want to set up a small demonstration plot," she said. "Something deliberate and recorded for the farmers in the county who expressed interest. I want to run the same cultivar under 3 different soil preparation conditions simultaneously and track the yields and the plant health over the full growing season." Timothy looked up from the accounts he was reviewing. "A field experiment." "Yes," she said, "with a written methodology that anyone could examine and replicate. Not just farming advice passed along verbally, but a documented process." He thought about this. It would take some of the best South field acreage for a season. It would also take Lillian's time and attention in a systematic way that might occasionally pull it away from the farm's immediate needs. He thought about all of this for approximately 4 seconds. "How much acreage do you need?" he said. She told him, and they worked out the specifics over the next hour, and when they were done, she looked at him with an expression that he had learned to read as gratitude expressed in the register of someone who is not accustomed to needing to be grateful, which made it more rather than less meaningful. "You are not worried about the yield loss from that section," she said. "The rest of the plan more than compensates," he said, "and the county connections are valuable. If this grows into something larger, it is good for us and good for the people around us." He paused. "Also," he said, "I want you to be able to do the work you love. That matters to me." She put down her pen. She looked at him with the particular focused attention she usually reserved for soil samples and important calculations. "It takes some getting used to," she said quietly. "What does?" "Having someone who wants that," she said. "It was not something I grew up expecting." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Tell me about that," he said. "About growing up, about Virginia." And she did. She talked for a long time, longer than she usually talked about herself, and he listened to the story of a girl who had watched a farm die and decided she would understand everything there was to understand about why, and who had fought for an education that the world around her suggested she did not need, and who had found, at the Missouri Research Station, the intellectual home she had been looking for, and who had left it to come west because the agency letter from a farmer in Kansas had described. In plain and honest language, a man who wanted someone real. "My father thought I was making a mistake," she said, "coming here. He said no sensible woman went west to marry a stranger." He is not wrong about the statistics, Timothy said. No, she said. But statistics are averages. They do not describe individual cases. She looked at him. This individual case has been different from what the statistics might suggest. I hope so, he said. It has, she said. And the way she said it with the same precision she brought to everything made it more trustworthy than any amount of elaborate declaration. Spring arrived in the way Kansas springs always did, tentatively and then all at once, the ground thawing in stages and the first green things pushing up through the remaining snow with an insistence that was almost aggressive. The farm woke up and demanded everything, and Timothy and Lillian gave it everything, moving through the long days of planting season with the efficient synchrony of two people who have figured out how to work together. Lillian's demonstration plot was set up in the first week of May, and she sent letters to the 7 farmers in the county who had expressed interest, including the man from western Harlan who had lost his crop to blight. 3 of them came out in person to watch the setup process, and they walked the prepared beds with Lillian while she explained the soil preparation methods with the kind of patient thoroughness that communicated both expertise and genuine desire to share it. Timothy watched from the edge of the field while she talked to the Halkett brother who had questioned her at the Dodge City meeting, a different man this time, a younger one with the careful eyes of someone who wanted to be wrong, and he watched Halkett's expression change through the familiar arc: skepticism, engagement, comprehension, and finally, the particular expression of someone who is reevaluating something they thought they knew. Ernst Halger came by in June, during a Sunday that both families spent together, and walked the south field with Timothy while Marta and Lillian sat on the porch and had what sounded like a very thorough conversation about the relative merits of different seed storage techniques. She is something else, Ernst said, in the considering way of a man who means it as the highest compliment. She is, Timothy said. You look different, Ernst said, than you did this time last year. I am different, Timothy said simply. Ernst nodded as though this confirmed something he had suspected for some time. Good, he said. It was time. The summer was kinder than the last. It was still dry, drier than average. But the management systems Lillian had implemented in the eastern fields over the winter months held. The drainage channels she had designed moved the minimal rainfall efficiently into the root zones and reduced the standing water that had promoted the blight. The soil amendments she had applied in early spring were showing in the leaf health of the corn, deep and green, and resilient in a way that the previous season's pale and struggling plants had not been. The demonstration plot was a revelation. The 3 plots had been set up with identical cultivar stock, but different soil preparation methods. By July, it was clear to anyone with eyes that the method Lillian had advocated produced substantially better plant health under the dry conditions. And by August, the yield projections were tracking exactly as she had predicted. She recorded everything in meticulous detail in a new set of notebooks she had started specifically for this project. In August, she discovered something she had not expected. Walking the far edge of the south field on a routine morning inspection, she found a section of ground that behaved differently under her feet than the surrounding area, with a slight spring to it that she had learned to associate with particular subsurface soil conditions. She went back with her tools and sampled carefully, and what she found sent her hurrying back to the farmhouse with dirt on her hands and excitement on her face that she was not entirely suppressing. Timothy was in the barn when she found him. He turned around at the sound of her footsteps and saw her expression and was immediately alert. "What is it?" he said. "I think there is a subsurface water lens under the south end of the east field," she said. "A significant one. Possibly fed by an underground formation that connects to the drainage basin north of the county line." He stared at her. "Water. Subsurface water. Accessible by a well, possibly by 2. If I am right about the formation, it would give us a reliable water source in the worst dry years, independent of the creek and the surface rainfall." He sat down on a hay bale. "How certain are you?" "About 70%, she said, which from Lillian was essentially a confident assertion. I want to do 2 more days of sampling before I am comfortable saying it absolutely, but the indicators are very consistent." He looked at her. "You have been reading this land like a book since you arrived," he said. "It is a book," she said. "A very old one, written by processes that have been happening for thousands of years. Most people just do not think to open it." She was right about the water. A well driller from Dodge City came out in September and put down 2 wells in the locations Lillian had specified, and struck water at the first in 28 feet and the second in 31. And the water that came up was cool and clear, and when Lillian tested it with her chemical methods, perfectly clean. The well driller, a man named Petrosky who had been drilling wells in Kansas for 15 years, stood at the edge of the new well and looked at Lillian with an expression of professional admiration. "How did you know exactly where to put them?" he asked. "Soil behavior and formation indicators," she said. "The literature on subsurface hydrology and prairie environments suggested the methodology. I simply applied it." Petrosky shook his head slowly. "I have been doing this 15 years, he said. "I have never drilled dry when someone pointed me to a location that well documented." That evening, after Petrosky had left and the farm was quiet again, Timothy found Lillian standing at the edge of the newly capped well with one hand resting on the wooden frame, looking at it with the satisfaction of someone who has completed something important. He came to stand beside her, and they looked at the well together. "Do you understand what you have done?" he said. "I have improved the farm's drought resilience," she said, "substantially. You have given this land a future," he said. "In a decade, 2 decades, when the dry years come again, and they will, this farm will survive because of what you found today." She was quiet for a moment. "I wanted it to last," she said. "I wanted something I was part of to last. My father's land did not last. I wanted this one too." He reached over and took her hand in both of his, the way he had learned she liked, entirely surrounding it. "It will last," he said, "because of you." She leaned against him, which was not something she did automatically or casually. It was a deliberate choice, and he put his arm around her and they stood at the edge of the well as the sun went down over the Kansas prairie in the particular orange and gold extravagance that October sunsets produce. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said. "I want this," she said. "This farm, this work, you. I want it the way I have never wanted anything I was supposed to want. When I was in Virginia, people had a very clear idea of what I should want, and none of it was this. None of it was soil samples and notebook calculations and standing in a field at dawn." "And this is better," he said. "This is mine," she said. "For the first time in my life, completely mine." He tightened his arm around her. "Ours," he said quietly. She considered this. "Ours," she agreed. The harvest of 1879 was the best the Chandler farm had ever produced. The eastern fields, with Lillian's drainage improvements and soil management program in place, yielded corn that was substantially above the county average despite the continuing dry conditions. The south field of drought-tolerant sorghum produced 2,800 bushels, 400 more than the previous year. The western wheat field came in clean and full. The demonstration plot data had already been written up by Lillian in a formal report that the Harlan County Agricultural Society had agreed to print and distribute to its membership, and copies had been requested from as far away as the Kansas State Agricultural Office in Topeka. Timothy made the harvest trip to Dodge City in late October with the wagon piled high, and came back with more money than he had ever brought home from a single season in the 10 years he had been farming this land. He paid off the remaining balance of the bank note 2 years ahead of schedule, and felt the particular lightness that comes from being completely out of debt, which is one of the finest feelings a farming man can have. He came home in the afternoon and found Lillian in the south field, walking the rows of harvested sorghum, doing her post-season soil sampling, the glass vials clinking gently in her satchel. He unhitched Josiah and turned him into the paddock, and then walked out across the yard and through the south gate and across the harvested field to where she was crouching over a sample, and he crouched down beside her. She looked at him. She saw something in his face and said, "How much?" he told her. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "That is a very good number." "It is a remarkable number," he said, "for this farm, for this county, in a dry year. Abernathy is going to want to interview you again for the Society Bulletin." "He can wait until after the new year," she said, and tucked her sample vial carefully into the rack in her satchel. "Lillian," he said. She looked up at him. "We need to talk about the house," he said. She waited. "The parlor," he said, "and the bedroom, and in particular the room currently being used for storage on the east side of the house." She was still waiting, but her eyes had done something, a slight quickening. "I think we need to make some changes," he said, "to the way the house is arranged." "What kind of changes?" she said very carefully. He looked at her with the steady, direct look that she had come to understand was Timothy at his most unguarded. "The kind that would require adding a crib," he said, "and possibly, within a year or two, a bed small enough for a person who is not yet full-sized." Lillian set down her satchel very deliberately. She stood up. She looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, not the precise, focused intelligence, not the quiet humor, not the careful warmth. Something entirely different and entirely unguarded. "Are you asking me what I think you are asking?" she said. "If you think I am asking whether we ought to start a family," he said, "then yes." She put her hands on either side of his face, which was not a thing she did. Lillian was not a person who touched faces, and she kissed him with a thoroughness that left him somewhat rearranged, standing in the middle of the harvested sorghum field in the afternoon light of a Kansas October. When she pulled back, she was still holding his face and looking at him with those dark, direct eyes. "Yes," she said, "that is what I want." The winter that followed was the warmest they had spent on the farm, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. The farmhouse, which had been gradually transformed over the 18 months of their marriage from the bare and functional shelter of a single man's practical existence into something that genuinely deserved the word home, took on a quality that both of them recognized but neither tried to name, because naming it might make it fragile. They told Ernst and Marta in February. Marta cried and immediately began a list of every piece of baby equipment they possessed from their own 3 children, and which of it could be repurposed. Ernst shook Timothy's hand and then pulled him into a brief, fierce embrace that was entirely out of character and entirely genuine. "She has been good for you," Ernst said gruffly. "She has been everything," Timothy said, with a plainness that made Ernst look at him for a moment in the way old friends look at each other when they see a truth they are glad about. Lillian spent the winter continuing her research and correspondence. The formal agricultural report she had written about the demonstration plot results had generated a response from the Kansas State Agricultural Office that was, by any measure, significant. A man named Dr. Elias Bard, who ran the state's nascent experimental agricultural program out of Manhattan, Kansas, wrote a letter to Mrs. Timothy Chandler of Harlan County, expressing his professional admiration for the methodology of her study, and asking if she would be willing to serve as a county-level agricultural advisor under the newly forming extension program the state was attempting to establish. She read the letter twice and then brought it to Timothy. He read it and then looked at her and said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to accept," she said. "It would mean occasional travel to county meetings. It would mean time I am not on the farm. Will it take you away from here significantly?" He said, "No," she said. "The county-level role is largely correspondence and quarterly meetings. The farm would always come first, but I want to be honest with you about the commitment." He thought about the woman who had arrived on the Harlan stage with her leather trunks and her glass vials and her 11 pounds of seed. He thought about what it would have meant to her, at 21 years old in Virginia, to have someone tell her to put away her interests because they were inconvenient. "Accept it," he said. "Of course accept it." She wrote to Dr. Bard the following week. Their son was born in June of 1880, which made the summer complicated and wonderful in equal measure. He was a large, healthy, extremely opinionated baby who arrived in the world with a degree of noise that suggested he intended to make his presence felt, and he was named James for Timothy's father and William for Lillian's, which they had agreed on without argument during a quiet February evening. James William Chandler was, from the beginning, the most interesting thing either of his parents had encountered. He was, as all infants are, demanding and all-absorbing and occasionally maddening, but he was also the specific gravity that completed a thing neither Timothy nor Lillian had realized was incomplete. The farmhouse acquired a dimension with him in it that it had not had before, which is the dimension of life ongoing and increasing, of something being built not just for now but for afterward. Ernst and Marta came out the week of James's birth and stayed 3 days and were very helpful, and the Denny brothers who worked the harvest season sent a practical gift of a carved wooden cradle that was both beautiful and genuinely well-made, and even Abernathy from the Agricultural Society sent a letter of congratulations that managed to mention, in the final paragraph, that Mrs. Chandler's spring presentation was eagerly anticipated. Lillian returned to her notebooks with James strapped to her chest in a carrier she had fashioned from a length of canvas, which meant that the first field survey of the 1880 season was conducted with a baby attached to her front, which was an arrangement she found perfectly workable and which Captain the dog found deeply fascinating. Timothy watched her moving across the south field with James bundled against her, the leather satchel on her shoulder, the small notebook in her free hand, and he felt the love he had for this woman as a physical pressure in his chest, enormous and very specific, the kind of love that has been built from hundreds of small, precise observations rather than a single large event. He took over the morning feeding twice a week so that she could do her field work without the carrier, and she taught him how to read the soil color at the field edges for moisture content, and he made breakfast more often than not, and they moved through the season with a partnership that had grown from its practical roots into something so thoroughly interwoven that it was no longer possible to describe where one person's contribution ended and the other's began. The harvest of 1880 was again exceptional, and the Southfield sorghum exceeded 3,000 bushels for the first time. The corn in the eastern fields, under 3 years of Lillian's management protocol, was yielding numbers that the men at the Dodge City Grain Exchange had stopped being surprised by because surprise had been replaced by simple expectation. At the Harlan County Autumn Social, which was held in October in the large barn of the church, Lillian was asked by 4 separate people for farming advice of various kinds, and she gave it with the patient thoroughness she brought to everything. And Timothy stood near the punch bowl and watched his wife hold court in a church barn in Kansas and felt the quiet, enormous pride that had become the steady background note of his life. He went over after the 4th person had thanked her and moved away, and she looked up at him with a slightly tired expression that was still unmistakably satisfied. "You are going to need to charge people for this eventually," he said. "I am not going to charge people for agricultural advice," she said. "Then at minimum," he said, "you need to finish your punch." She accepted the glass he handed her. "Dr. Bard wrote again," she said. "He wants to discuss the possibility of expanding the extension program's scope. There may be a formal publication involved. Tell me about it on the way home," he said. She told him on the way home in the wagon, with James asleep between them wrapped in a wool blanket, and the October stars spilling across the Kansas sky above them in their impossible thousands. By 1882, the Chandler farm was recognized throughout Harlan County and into the surrounding area as something unusual. Not the largest farm, and not the wealthiest in absolute terms, though it was doing well, but the most consistently productive and the most forward-thinking in its methods. Farmers came from neighboring counties to see the demonstration plots, which Lillian had continued and expanded, and to speak with the woman whose report on drought-tolerant cultivar management had been published by the Kansas State Agricultural Program and distributed across 3 states. She was, Timothy knew, becoming something important in her field, in the most literal and figurative sense. The letters she exchanged with researchers in Missouri and Kansas, and increasingly from agricultural institutions in the eastern states, were substantive professional correspondence between equals. Dr. Bard had visited the farm in person the previous autumn and spent 2 days with Lillian going over her multi-year data, and had left with what Timothy recognized as the expression of a man who has encountered someone operating at a level he had not anticipated. None of it made her smaller to live with, or more difficult, or distant. This was the thing he had understood about Lillian from the very beginning, though he had not yet had language for it, that her intelligence and independence were not things she had in spite of warmth, they were things she had along with it, as parts of the same whole. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1883. They named her Clara Ruth, for Lillian's mother who had died when Lillian was 12, and whose loss was the quiet permanent sorrow at the back of Lillian's life. Clara arrived in the world with somewhat less noise than James had, but with what the midwife described as an expression of very decided opinion, which suggested she was going to be manageable. She was not, in the event, particularly manageable. She was, at 8 months, attempting to stand in her cradle and using her brother as a climbing structure. At 14 months, she was walking with the purposeful confidence of someone who has understood what feet are for and is not interested in wasting any more time being carried. At 2 years, she followed Lillian into the south field and sat in the dirt between the sorghum rows and put small handfuls of soil in her mouth with an expression of solemn scientific inquiry that made Lillian and Timothy look at each other over her head, with expressions that were equal parts laughter and a certain specific, private wonder. The farmhouse was full in a way it had never been in the years of Timothy's solitary tenure. Full of James's questions, which were numerous and continuous, and usually about horses or the weather or why things were the way they were, and Clara's firm opinions, and the warm, persistent noise of a family living entirely in the space it inhabited. One evening in the autumn of 1883, after the children were asleep and the farm was quiet, Timothy came to the parlor where Lillian was sitting with her notebooks in the lamplight, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at her. She looked up. She saw something in his face and put down her pen. "What?" she said. He came in and sat down across from her in the way he had that first real evening together, when they had talked about the farm until past midnight. "I was thinking about the day you arrived," he said. "The stage from Dodge City." She looked at him. "You were waiting at the depot with your hat in your hands," she said. He blinked. "You noticed that?" "I notice everything," she said. "You know that." "I know that now," he said. "I did not know it then." He leaned back in the chair. "I remember thinking when I watched you handle the trunk that you were someone who did not waste time." "That is accurate," she said. "And now," he said, "I think I was underestimating it. You do not waste anything. Not time, not soil, not knowledge, not," he paused, finding the word, "not care. You give things completely when you give them." She watched him quietly. "I want to say something to you," he said, "that I have not said in exactly this way." "All right," she said. "You saved this farm," he said. "The south field, the wells, the soil management, the drought cultivars. Materially, absolutely, you saved it. The banknote would have been called, we would have lost the acreage, and 5 years of work would have come apart. That is the practical truth." She opened her mouth and he raised one hand slightly. "Let me finish," he said. "That is the practical truth, but it is not the most important truth. The most important truth is that I was living on this farm alone for 10 years, and I was building something, and it was real, and it mattered, and I was good at it. And none of it was ever as good as it has been since you came. Not the farming, not the seasons, not the mornings." He stopped. "Not any of it." The lamplight was warm between them, and the house was quiet with the specific quiet of sleeping children and a cold night outside and a warm room inside. "Timothy," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, which was rare enough to matter. "I know," he said. "I know you know, but I wanted to say it plainly. You deserve to hear it plainly." She came around the table and sat beside him, which was not how the chairs in the parlor were arranged, but she moved one to be next to his and sat in it, very close, and he took her hand. "I came west," she said, "because I had run out of places to be what I am. The research station in Missouri was good, but it was not mine. The world in Virginia had already made up its mind about what I was supposed to want." She looked at their joined hands. "I wrote to the agency because the description of a Kansas farmer who wanted someone capable and honest seemed like a person I could be honestly with. That was the extent of my expectation." "And now," he said. "Now," she said, "I understand that expectation is a very limited way of living." She looked up at him. "This is more than I expected." "You are more than I expected." "In what direction?" he said, with the careful, quiet humor that had developed between them over the years, dry and precise, and only used when the emotional stakes were high enough to require the buffer. "In every direction," she said, "including directions I did not know to look." He pulled her close with one arm, and she rested against him, and they sat together in the lamplight of the parlor that had grown from a single chair to something full and alive. And outside the Kansas prairie stretched away in the dark in all directions, immense and patient and indifferent to the small human drama of love and survival being conducted on its surface, but giving, as it gave to everyone who paid it proper attention, everything it had in return for being properly understood. The years that followed were good years. Not perfect, because no years are perfect on a farm in Kansas or anywhere else. And there were hard seasons and difficult problems, and one terrible spring, when a late freeze took the apple and pear orchard, and they spent 2 days cutting back frost-killed wood and planting new stock, and a summer when James broke his arm falling from the roof of the barn where he had absolutely no business being, and a winter when a sickness went through the county and kept them all in bed for 2 weeks and tested everyone's patience and stamina considerably. But the hard times were met with the resources they had built together. The financial stability of a consistently productive farm, the social network of their relationships with the Halgers and the surrounding farming community, the deep and particular knowledge of their own land that Lillian had been accumulating and recording since she first arrived, and the specific kind of resilience that 2 people develop when they have been tested together enough times to trust completely in what the other one brings. In 1885, Lillian's collected research on drought-tolerant crop cultivation methods in the Central Plains was published as a formal monograph by the Kansas State Agricultural Office, with an introduction by Dr. Elias Bard acknowledging it as the most comprehensive field-based study of the subject produced in the state. Copies went to agricultural institutions in 7 states and, eventually, to the recently established United States Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C., where it was read and cited in internal correspondence that Lillian would not know about for several more years. She received the first copies of the published monograph on a Wednesday afternoon in October, and she sat at the kitchen table with the slim, serious-looking volume in her hands and turned the pages with a careful, almost reverential attention that Timothy watched from across the room. He had helped with the final editing, reading every page aloud to her while she listened for sentences that did not land exactly right, and he had driven the manuscript to Topeka himself in August to make sure it reached the printer on time, because Lillian had been sick that week with a summer cold and was not in any condition to be hauling herself to Topeka, a point on which he had been firm, and which she had accepted with somewhat less argument than he expected. Which told him how sick she actually was. He went and sat beside her at the kitchen table while she turned the pages. "Well," he said. "It is exactly what I wanted it to be," she said, with the quiet satisfaction of a person who has done something exactly right. "Yes," he said, "it is." James, who was 5 and had been listening from the doorway with his characteristic intense curiosity, came in and climbed onto the chair beside his mother and looked at the book. "Is that yours?" he said. "Yes," Lillian said. "You wrote the whole thing," he said. "I did," she said. He considered this with 5-year-old gravity. "Can I read it?" He said, "In a few years," she said, "when you understand about soil composition." "Tell me about soil composition," he said immediately. She looked at Timothy over James's head with an expression that was helpless and delighted in equal measure, and he looked back at her with the same expression, and between them sat their son asking his endless questions in the lamplit kitchen of a farmhouse on 430 acres of deep Kansas soil. "All right," Lillian said to James, and opened the book to the first page. "We will start at the beginning." In the spring of 1887, on a warm April morning when the land was beginning its annual awakening, and the fields were showing the first green haze of new growth, Timothy walked the south field at dawn the way he had walked it every morning for 9 years now. The sorghum from the previous autumn had been cut, and the ground was bare and dark and ready, and the morning smelled of the particular mineral richness of turned earth after a mild winter. He walked to the center of the field and stood there and looked back at the farmhouse, where lamplight still showed in the kitchen window. Through that window he could see movement, the shadow of his wife beginning the morning, and somewhere above the kitchen window, he knew the children were still asleep. James in his room with his books and his notebooks, already showing signs of becoming someone who would spend a great deal of time in earnest conversation with the world, and Clara in her room with the firm, private interior life of someone who has decided things for herself and is simply waiting until she is tall enough to act on them. The farm was whole. The land was 430 acres of deep, well-understood, carefully tended prairie soil. The wells gave reliable water even in the driest months. The eastern fields were producing at consistently superior yields after a decade of intelligent management. The south field was the best-performing sorghum plot in the county. The apple and pear orchard, replanted after the devastating late freeze of 1884, was beginning to produce seriously again. The farmhouse was full and warm and spoke, in every detail, of two people who had built something together. He had started with nothing but the land and the stubbornness to work it. He had nearly lost everything in a single terrible summer. And then a woman had stepped off a stage from Dodge City with her glass vials and her notebooks and 11 pounds of seed, and had quietly, methodically, completely changed what this land was capable of being. He had been a good farmer before Lillian. He had known that and had been, in the careful, unsentimental way of a practical man, appropriately proud of it. But he had not known what he did not know. He had looked at the surface of his land and seen what was above it, the crops, the weather, the yield numbers, the bank note, and he had not understood that beneath the surface there was a whole world of cause and mechanism and possibility that a person with the right knowledge and the right eye could see and work with and transform. He had thought the crop failed. He had stood on the porch in the gray September morning and felt the betrayal of years of work and told his wife it was over. And she had taken him to the south field. He thought about that morning often. He thought about it with a gratitude that was not uncomplicated, because part of what he was grateful for was the reminder of his own limits, which is not a comfortable thing to be grateful for, but which is, he had learned, one of the most important kinds. He had been wrong about what was growing on his own land because he had not thought to look in the right place. He had been wrong about what his wife knew because he had not thought to ask. He had been wrong about whether she had anything to teach him because the world he had grown up in had not prepared him to expect it. He had corrected all of those things. He stood in the center of the south field in the April morning and thought about all of it, and then he walked back to the farmhouse. Lillian was at the stove when he came in, making the coffee with the efficient certainty she brought to every physical task. She looked up when he came through the door and registered something in his face. "You walked the south field," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. He hung his coat on the hook and came to the stove and stood behind her and put his arms around her, his chin resting on the top of her head, which was a thing he did when the feeling was too large for words, which happened more often than anyone who had known him before Lillian would have expected. She put her hand over his arms the way she did. "Spring is here," she said. "Spring is here," he agreed. "We have good things to plant," she said. "The best," he said. The coffee began to smell its way through the kitchen, and upstairs James could be heard starting to move around in his room with the decisive energy of a 7-year-old who has decided the day should begin, and Clara's small, firm footsteps would follow within minutes. "Timothy," Lillian said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad I wrote back to your letter," she said. He held her more tightly for a moment. "So am I," he said. "Every single day." Outside the farmhouse, the Kansas morning continued opening. The light moved across the fields in its eastward way, illuminating the turned earth of the south field and the neat rows of the eastern acres, and the new growth in the orchard, and the dark shining water of the 2 wells that Lillian had found beneath ground that had always been there waiting for someone with the knowledge to look for it. The farm breathed in the morning. The harvest, when it came, would be remarkable. The land knew this already in the way land knows things, in the slow, patient, hidden language of root and soil and water and time, spoken in a register that most people never hear, but that one woman had made it her life's work to understand, and had brought to one particular farm in Harlan County, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, and had never stopped speaking since. It was enough. It was, in every way that mattered, more than enough. It was everything.